Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for arriving on time. And those of you who arrived early, we are now into week 3 of conversations on racial equity. And before I go too far, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Woiwurrung Nation and the Bunurong people of the Boon Wurrung Nation of the Eastern Kulin Nation here in Naarm. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of past, present, and future, and to acknowledge that we are living on their unceded territory, and this is in fact their country. Talking about racial equity, we have to constantly remind ourselves that there is an ongoing colonization that we are part of, benefiting from, in fact, and that has to be forefront of our minds whenever we enter these discussions. Please keep the chat lively. I love hearing and reading your comments. I do have it up and open sometimes while we are going through the session. Sophie will save any questions that I forget to answer, and I will look through them. Good morning, Carrie from all the way over Canada, I believe, homeland of the Anish. Oh, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that because I'll probably not be able to say that properly. Hi, Nagat. Hello, Joanne. All right, so this is week 3, and this week we're going to talk about media and the role of the media in perpetuating and or dismantling racism. And we're going to build on the learnings of the previous session. So as I mentioned, if you missed the first 2 weeks, do catch up on that session by going to YouTube and typing in conversations on racial equity, or going to our website, which will give you the links for. Obviously, you all know our website. So without any further ado, let me pull up the slides and get stuck into today. This is another acknowledgement of country, that we are in the land of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and specifically we are all calling from different nations. Normally we call from the land of Palawa people in Lutruwita. Today we are calling from the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people and the Bunurong Boonwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. Those of you who have been diligent in attending or watching the recordings will be aware that these are some of the key issues we've covered. So if you're new to tonight's session, which please do let me know. If you've just arrived and you haven't watched week 1 and 2 and you weren't there live or watch the recording, let us know in the chat, just so I've got an idea as to how many of you there are. Otherwise, I'll assume you've either watched these or you'll go back and watch the first few sessions that we've had. So we've unpacked some of the core concepts. We've gone a little bit into the subtleties of race and how it functions in society. We've unpacked the difference between some of these key terms, between prejudice and racism. We've talked about unconscious bias. We've unpacked the construct of race. And we've developed, by this stage, by week 3, a somewhat more nuanced understanding of what racism is, and connected it to the concept of cultural superiority. And that term will come up a number of times in today's session. I've got to say, preparing this week's session was one of the more difficult things I've done in the last couple of weeks. And it has been going through the content and to unpack it for you, watching and reading some of the newspaper articles out there. It's quite confronting, and it exists, racism in the media, and it's difficult to stare it down and unpack it for everybody. So let's go through and begin unpacking some of what I found for you this week. As you're aware, as a foundational believer, I do believe in the oneness of humanity, and that quote that we shared at the very beginning of the seminar series from Baha'u'llah talks about that the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens. So we do believe in this inherent oneness, and I'm assuming most of you here tonight, hold some sort of similar belief system in that we are connected, whether it's as one family or one environmental being, whatever it happens to be. And yet this kind of disparity that we've discussed in the first couple of sessions does exist in society. And we are now going to look at the role of the media in perpetuating this or dismantling this, and how we can develop a more nuanced awareness of some of the racism that exists in media, beyond the obvious, beyond the things that you can easily point out. I want to unpack some of the more systemic and pervasive elements of it. We touched on a systems approach in week 1 as well. So anyone who missed week 1, we did talk about a systems approach to social equity. And I want you to begin really developing this idea that racial injustice and racial inequity is an outcome of a complex system. And there's a bunch of different interrelated mechanisms and functions, policies and histories, and that actually cause the outcome of racial inequity. It's not one thing or another specifically. It's a complex ecosystem of different elements that are interrelated and cause impact on one another much like the human body or any other system, like a local ecosystem, an organizational culture, a community. The idea of systems thinking is built on the idea that, these systems function properly or improperly, depending on the relationships between the various individual components. This image you're probably familiar with, and you can understand how, systems thinking makes sense in the terms of an ecosystem. One species overpowering another, or one species going extinct, or too much of one chemical in an ecosystem can put out the entire ecosystem. So we can understand systems thinking in that sense. What I'd like to begin developing in your minds from here on is the idea of how these types of elements here are interrelated and impact on each other with regards to racial equity. So looking at that image, some of you can already immediately say, well, I understand how, say, media impacts politics and potentially politics impacts media, or I could understand how education impacts employment, and employment opportunities could definitely impact wealth, right? So that's pretty easy to understand. That doesn't seem like a very complex equation to understand. Mind you, each one of those individual components is in itself quite complex. But then if you look deeper, you'll understand that actually the media, or the way the media portrays certain people or issues, can impact sport, it can impact health, it can impact politics, vice versa. Sport can impact school, what happens on the sporting field, how it's covered. If there's a issue of racism in sports, for example, and that's covered in a particularly racist way, that impacts the student's experience at school, which also impacts mental health and educational outcome. Go further, and then you realize actually each one of these things has a inextricably interconnected relationship with a group of the other elements involved. And this is beginning to become very, very complex, obviously. Today, we're going to unpack the main influences of the media. Obviously, I can't give you a 10-point plan how to end racism in society. It's not possible because every context is unique, and every unique context requires significant consultation and a context-specific solution. So we can't solve that in an hour and a half or even in 12 sessions, because every one of you works in different areas, and the solutions required, the strategies required will vary from place to place and time to time. What I can give you, as I've mentioned throughout this series, is a more nuanced, deeper, detailed awareness of how race functions, so that then with the help of a consultant or an organizing or a committee, you can then come up with solutions. And that requires your commitment and ongoing patience and dedication to the work. So today, I'm not going to be able to solve all of the racism that exists in the media because it's got a 500-year history, but I'm going to give you an awareness of some things to keep an eye out for and potentially have some conversations to start. We've discussed the idea that normally we think of racism and we think of images like this. So when the word racism comes up, we like to throw it into the past and say, yep, it happened during slavery or during colonization or during segregation. Or we like to pin it on specifically very conservative or like extremist kind of viewpoints like the Ku Klux Klan, and we think that's racism, that's white supremacy, that's got nothing to do in our community. And sometimes we think it's images like this, where an individual is being particularly prejudiced or a group towards another person, which is interpersonal racism. But as we've discussed, sometimes it can look as seemingly innocent as an image like this, which is just a photograph of a corporate event entertainer using an image that they thought was appropriate to advertise it. However, if your corporate event looks like that, there's obviously something going on if it's that overwhelmingly made up of one particular ethnicity. Sometimes racism can look like this. This is where we get into the media side, where a news anchor or a morning show host talking to two sisters from the same parents accidentally, on purpose, compliments one of the sisters for having lighter skin than the other. And that particular piece of audio I'm not going to play for you today. It's quite gut-wrenching. And unfortunately, it's part of a pattern of behavior from this particular show. Other times, racism can look like this, and we're going to unpack this particular image a little bit later as well. But gaslighting a person who has raised these issues of racism in an organization can also be racism within the media. So it's not about what color a person's skin is, it's about the way we unpack an issue, the way we discuss it. And if a person comes up with raising an issue of sexism or racism in an organization, and a person doubts their statements or gaslights them or double questions them, then that sometimes is able to help perpetuate racism in society if we don't have the backs of people who call it out. Sometimes racism can look like this, pure white, all white panel. On the left, you've got three individuals talking about the Aboriginal flag. On the right, you've got three individuals talking about the issue of child removals, Aboriginal children being removed from their families. And the group on the right will talk about later as well. So sometimes it's the mere makeup of a discussion panel or a TV panel without even a word having been uttered. The absence of certain people makes that problematic from the outset. And sometimes it can look like this. We're going to go deeper into this particular image and images like this later on, because sometimes racism doesn't need for somebody to tell you to go back to where you came from or for them to throw a racial slur at you. It's simply the way we portray other people or sometimes even ourselves. And we've got to question, why is it that certain images of other ethnicities is supported by the media and they've got their back, and other images are not? So we're going to unpack this phenomena and shows like this a little later today. Now, to get your involvement and inclusion in the conversation, I want to do a quick content analysis with an image. We all know that an image can speak 1,000 words. And with your permission, I'm going to show an image to you today. And I can't hear you, obviously, but I'm going to ask you to type away in the chat function of what comes to your mind when you have a look at this image. This is an image that I just grabbed off the internet. I was looking for something and this came across my feed, and I've actually written a whole essay on this particular photograph. But I want to show it to you now and ask for you to share your thoughts as to what comes to your mind if you were to think of the content, the context, the subtext. What are some of the words that come to your mind about this image that you are now seeing? As you look at that, I can already guess some of you would immediately have a very strong negative reaction to it. Some of you might have a weird reaction and feel uneasy about it and uncomfortable, but not quite sure why. And others might not know what's wrong with it at all. So have a look. If you're comfortable, share your thoughts. What does it say to you? You've got a desire to fit in. First comment was assimilation. Someone else says assimilation baby. Someone else says citizenship ceremony. Someone says, look at how happy they are looking like us, proving yourself. It says, I'm proud to be Australian and Muslim and female. Edward says it's shocking. Alex says it's perceived binaries. Well, look, that's right. Someone says happiness, but I'm wondering why they're wrapped in a flag. Well, that's exactly what we're looking at. We're questioning that point, that part of the image, right? Jules Smith, he said, trying to fit in on Australia Day. Thank you. Trying to convince white people that Black people can be patriotic. Thank you, Saskia. The context is important, says Danila, and I don't know enough about it. Great. Okay. So let's get into the context. You can keep typing away. I'll keep an eye on the chat if I can. So these two words of content, context, sorry, three words, content, context, and subtext. I want to unpack that a little bit. All right. Why aren't they wearing the costumes of their own culture? Well, they're not costumes. You mean the attire of their culture. Yep, there is that. They look genuinely happy and they are trying to stay dry. Okay, great. So let's now go to the next slide for you to have a look at some of the questions I'm asking. First and foremost, those children didn't wake up that morning and decide to wear that before they left the house. You need to be aware of this, right? This is an image that's been curated by a photographer. Their mother didn't dress them like that morning. So we're talking about the image, and we're understanding that it's curated by a photographer and is used by an editor. So beyond the fact that it's a curated image and someone has draped them in that flag and asked them to pose for a photograph, because that's not how normal people normally get out, leave their house. Someone says othering, thank you. Someone else says used for political egos, politicians' egos, very good. White liberalism, thank you. So the first point is the image is curated. right? These four young girls didn't wake up that morning, decide to dress like that. Secondly, the context. Someone mentioned the context, right? When is this image normally used? When you see this image pop up, it is during citizenship ceremonies. It is on the 26th of January. It is in editorial pieces talking about, how grateful migrants are to come to Australia. There's a context in there. Before we go into the subtext, just think about the context for a little bit. 26th of January, Invasion Day. You got editorial pieces about how grateful migrants are. You've got other days during the week, Harmony Week, which is actually the day for the elimination of racial discrimination, which we've relabeled as Harmony Week in Australia. It's around those times where that image pops up. Who else in the chat, just if you care to be honest, is actually scared when they see somebody draping their car in the Australian flag, or when they see the Australian flag hanging up in someone else's front yard? Just, someone's got to raise hand. Me, yes, totally. Me, yes, same. There you go. So for anyone who wasn't aware of that, there are a significant proportion of Australians who look like myself and others who actually have a visceral reaction of fear. Many people are concerned. Me, someone says, I don't like it. But if you see someone walking towards you draped in the Australian flag normally, if you see it in their front yard, it actually does elicit a fair bit of fear because it says a lot. And if you're not aware of what it says, then it probably hasn't impacted you negatively. Now let's get into the context and the subtext. By looking at that image, I'm going to pull it up for you. What is the editor who's using that image saying? The subtext is the silent assumptions underneath an image, right? So what does a person say when they use this image on a blog post or in an article or something like that? What are your thoughts on that? I want to see if anyone's got any thoughts on what the subtext is. Anyone who's a teacher or anyone who's literary minded will understand what subtext means immediately, right? That flag represents something, trying to convince nationalists that they are the same as us. Yeah, that's a good point, right? So they want to be like us, yeah. Also, you should try to be like us. When this image is shared, it is saying, we love refugees, we love migrants, you're all welcome here, but as long as you drape yourself in our cultural values and leave at the door your own sense of identity, your own culture, who it is to be you, because you're welcome here, but as long as you present yourself like this to us. That's subtext. That image says, we love refugees, but only when they wear themselves like this. It's actually an act of asking someone to be more submissive, because that's not how a person would normally dress themselves when they leave the house. Certainly not this group of young girls. That's what the subtext of this image is. And if you've got to have that sort of an understanding when you see photographs, film, content being spread about, you've got to think about who created that image, what is it saying, and what is it saying without saying anything as well, right? So we'll move on. I could talk for hours on this one image in itself. And as I said, I've written an essay on it. So if you'd like to know more about that image, you can go to my website and find that image. Yeah, someone else said, prove yourself. Exactly, prove yourself, submit to our cultural values. You're here now, we speak English in Australia. If you don't like it, F off. All of that is connected to this image. F off, we're full, or ascribe to our values, or we speak English in Australia, you're in our country now, etc., etc., etc. Right, so now let's move on. Let's move on to some other content. As we've explained in week 1 and 2, race is a construct and it was created over several centuries to justify the slavery and the genocide that was part of colonization. And that's how we ended up in a situation of racial inequity, right? There was 400-500 years of segregation, slavery, and then colonization that created racial inequality. And that was justified by the idea of race. So if you want to know more about that, go back to week 1 and 2 and we'll unpack that. From the very beginning of that construct of race being created, we had Western European writers trying to create this line of differentiation. And Gomes de Zurara was one of them. He's a Portuguese writer, and he was requested to write this book called The Discovery and Conquest of Guinea, where he began outlining how the white race was superior, how our culture is superior to these people's culture, and this is why they have no civilization really, and this is why we're allowed to enslave them. This is exactly around the time that slavery of the West African people began by the Europeans. And this book was one of the pieces of content used to justify that slavery. So be aware that this media influence we're talking about has a 500-year history on the idea of race. Obviously, centuries later, we've spoken about this as well. This is just a refresher for anyone who forgot. These are the names of some of the people who contributed to this idea of race, that yes, there's 4, 5, 6, or 8 races that exist, and some are superior than others, and that's why they are the slave owners, and that's why these people have been enslaved. These are the names of the people who tried to justify that idea. And again, we've already covered that. But from the beginning right through to today, the idea of race, first and foremost, wouldn't even exist without the support of media content, whether it's books, whether it's films, whether it's TV commercials, whether it's children's books, whatever it happens to be. Racism is an unnatural thing. It requires something to feed it constantly. And this has a very long history, from the Chronicle of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea, written by Gomez de Zurara, to the film The Birth of a Nation. If anyone has not heard of this film, The Birth of a Nation, please do Google it. This film was originally titled Klansman, and it's where a white actor in blackface plays a black character who attempts to rape a white woman, and then the white woman throws herself off of a cliff to escape this rapist, and then the Ku Klux Klan actually chase down this black man and they lynch him. That was the first film that was ever shown in the White House of the United States of America, and it was acclaimed, critically acclaimed, as a huge cinematic success by the president himself. And this is one of the first films ever made in the US. And from the first instance of making film in the US, the idea of race was being perpetuated and the racial division was being enforced. Those of you familiar with blackface and the portrayal of First Nations peoples as savages in film industry, you're aware that that carried all the way through to this very day. It's still happening. Then you've got media commentators, and then you've got shows more recently, Fat Pizza, Super Walk, Here Come the Habibs, all sorts of content. It's got a long legacy, a long heritage. And we're going to unpack some of the more recent parts of this. This racism, as I said, requires propagation. It's an unnatural phenomenon for us. We are inherently wanting connection. We are inherently designed to create and build community. And the idea that one race is superior or inferior to another is something that needs to be constantly fed. And we're going to look at some of the media that feeds that today. Those of you who are interested in the difference between prejudice and unconscious bias, we touched on them a couple of weeks back, and I will be doing a full session on unconscious bias later on. But I just wanted to differentiate these two from each other so you can understand they are different, but they do overlap. Prejudice is of the heart, unconscious bias is of the mind, and sometimes they even overlap. And unconscious bias is created by the content that we consume, the imagery that we see repeated through the films that we watch, through the news articles that we read, through the cartoons that our children are watching, through the children's books that our children are reading. They reinforce certain ideas in our mind, even when you consciously disagree with them. They form the synapses in our brains, form connections, and most of our processing actually, unfortunately, happens in the unconscious mind. And we're going to unpack that in a future session so you can understand a bit deeper how none of us are actually immune to unconscious bias. And oftentimes our unconscious bias runs counter to the ideas we consciously uphold. These are the images I'm talking about, from children's cartoons to films to comedians to newspaper headlines, talking about people in certain ways, finding certain angles, to this. Any ideas on what I had to Google to find these images? Any thoughts on while I was preparing to put these images together, what did I have to Google to find this group of images? Batiste, housewife, women in advertising, cleaning products, Penny Taylor, got it. That's exactly, I mean, I could have Googled any of those things. Yeah, you could have Googled a good woman, and some very sexist people would have attributed these ideas to that as well. But the words I actually used was cleaning products. So you Google cleaning, you don't need to search for sexism in advertising. You just search for cleaning products, and this is the kind of imagery that comes up. And this type of stereotyping is so detrimental to how our brains function and the prejudices that we form and the unconscious biases that we form, that eventually the UK government put in legislation to ban stereotypes in advertising that show men as incompetent in housework, because that creates this gender construct and it reinforces toxic power dynamics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll unpack that in a future session. These are some of the images I want you to draw your attention to today. The images on the left are political cartoons by Australian cartoonists. The image on the far right bottom is an NRL player in Australia who is not Indigenous, but decided to dress themselves up like this and carry a can of petrol. The image in the top middle is the one of the film I just mentioned earlier, The Birth of a Nation. These types of images have got a very long history and heritage, as I mentioned. The image on the top left is a cartoon by Bill Leak, who we're going to unpack a little bit later. These images also I'm referring to. Some of these images, some people might have trouble understanding what's so racist about it. But when you are reinforcing and constantly reenacting specific stereotypes that portray people in a certain way, it is no different to this. It's this called Arab blackface. Dehumanizing, belittling, and typecasting people in a certain way. The fact that you've got people from Lebanon or Iraq or Iran sometimes writing some of these shows does not make it any less racist. It's still the reinforcement of a stereotype. Now, that's how we end up with biases, because our brain processes most of its information in an unconscious manner. And sometimes that bias and prejudice actually overlap. And this is a hyperlinked article that I mentioned a second ago about the UK writing a legislation policy to ban adverts that showed men as not able to do their fair share of housework, because they finally saw the research and it was too detrimental to society, so they banned it. So this stuff is true and valid and has got enough research behind it for governments to begin writing legislation against it. And yet we still allow images like these ones to be shown on our screens. And that's a question we need to ask ourselves of why. Why do we allow ourselves to be subjected to these types of images? And what happens when we try and speak up against it? We're going to have a deeper session on systemic racism in later on in the series. And I've shown you this image briefly in the past. And today we're going to look at the particular pillar on the far right there, the media system, right? And how it reinforces and perpetuates racism within society. It instigated it in the beginning 500 years ago, and now it's perpetuating it. How? How is it? Let's have a look at some of that. Before we do, I want to remind you of how nuanced and diverse racism is, right? There's the overt prejudice that sometimes we look at. There's the systemic inequity of health, wealth, education outcomes, incarceration rates, etc. And then on the far right of that image, you can see the sense of superiority that exists as well. So cultural superiority can be a bit more subtle than outright prejudice sometimes. So let's keep an eye out for that part of it. If you've not seen this image, if you've missed week 1 and 2, please go back and watch those sessions, because we do a full step-by-step breakdown of this wheel of misfortune from prejudice to cultural superiority. And we break down each one of these in about 8 different steps. I just wanted to show you that quickly to refresh your mind, that we go from outright death and racial violence to words that are much more subtle and yet still taste the same. Now we're going to get into racism in the media. This image that you're staring at was printed in an Australian newspaper, and it's showing an Aboriginal boy being held by the scruff of his neck and presented to his father, and his father being asked to speak to his son about his behavior. And the cartoonist decided to not only show an Aboriginal youth as delinquent, but also his father as incompetent. And the father saying, yeah, righto, what's his name then? I doubt that anyone who's come to this session today has any trouble understanding how deeply racist and traumatic that image is. Is it like, I highly doubt it. If you've come to this session, then you've definitely got enough of an awareness of what is so horrific about this image. Am I right in assuming that? your thoughts on this image? What do you feel? What do you think when you see something like this printed in a newspaper? What are your thoughts on this? It's deeply shaming, highly racist. It's disgusting. These are your words in the chat. Yes. So we don't have any issue with it. Like as in, we don't have any issue understanding the racism within this issue, within this image, right? This empowering of the Aboriginal man, and it is a completely untrue stereotype. It's a stereotype. It is not. We have Aboriginal barristers, judges, lawyers. We've got Aboriginal academics, teachers, authors, poets. Every sphere of life you can think about, even after the colonization and genocide that First Nations people have survived. And yet this is how this particular cartoonist wanted to portray them. What's really troubling is not just that the image was printed and the editorial decision-making process that went behind it, but I want to highlight this to you, and I want you to keep an eye out for this. This cartoon was not only printed, but then defended, and not by just one author, but by dozens and dozens of writers and journalists around the world. The words that you're seeing on the slide now from Mark Knight are defending Bill Leak for this cartoon, right? And if you read the full article, it's really difficult to read, to actually make it to the end, because he's acting in such strong resistance and defense of this person. Now, he's saying that we've lost our larrikin spirit and we can't have fun anymore. And, whatever you do out there is going to be called as racist. And he's having a go at anyone who finds this image disturbing. Now, who is this author? This journalist, happens to be the same person who published that horrific cartoon of Serena Williams. And he is here now defending another cartoonist who did this image. So you got one cartoonist putting out a racist image, another defending him, responsible for this image, and then another one defending him, Emily Watkins defending Mark Knight, right? So it's fun at the expense of others, but it's more than that. It's much more deeper than that, because beyond just this one or two people defending it, you had defense from The Australian, from one author. This article was so disgusting that they removed the name of who even published it. It says down the bottom of the page here, if you can read it, he's quoting Freud. He says, nature, by endowing individuals with extremely unequal physical and mental capacities, has introduced injustices against which there is no remedy. This is the kinds of things we publish in our Australian papers. And then another one defending that cartoon, saying that there was nothing racist about it. Another one defending it from The Australian, saying there was nothing wrong about it. Another one from The Guardian, quoting Malcolm Turnbull, saying there was nothing wrong about it. Another one from the Courier Mail and the SBS. So we like to think that we've got, diversity in our media and there's different perspectives. But here I want to show you side by side the Courier Mail and SBS, both defending that same cartoon. This is how deep it runs. It's not just about the image that was portrayed. It's about how people stand shoulder to shoulder, arms linked together in defense of racism. And this is the content that we are allowing to be published in our media system. This one from the ABC was fantastic because there was one particular line that I just grabbed onto and I thought, yeah, this highlights exactly how racist our media can be. Not only was this particular article from the ABC supporting Bill Leak in publishing that cartoon, but they said this line here, which I wanted to share with you. A quote from Bill Leak himself. They say, he said, freedom of speech is what created our civil and free society. It is all about the exchange of ideas, about letting people express their views in the marketplace of ideas. So we've got a highly racist cartoon that's been printed in an Australian paper, which no one thought there was an issue with. And then we've got dozens of different newspapers from around the country, media outlets defending that cartoon, even though it's obvious to most of you here how racist that was. And then we've got the author of the cartoon, the illustrator of that cartoon, saying that apparently that we have to respect the marketplace of ideas and that this is what our society is built on, free speech and freedom of speech. Anyone got any thoughts on what happens when that freedom of speech is used to say something that, say, the media machinery doesn't like? Have you got any examples that come to your mind of someone who did try to use their freedom of speech and what repercussions they face? Because I've got one person in mind that I want to share with you. Thank you. Yasmin, the two of you mentioned that you know exactly who I was thinking about. So I want to go back to this quote because this person says freedom of speech is about is what created our civil free society. And it's all about an exchange of ideas, letting people express their views in a marketplace of ideas. Sounds lovely, except for the fact that when someone does try to express their views in a not so horrific way, in a quite subtle way, in fact, they get hounded and chased out of the country by every single one of those media outlets that I just showed you. Every single one of those media outlets that we just showed you who were defending that racist cartoons, from the Courier Mail, the Guardian, the Australian, the Conversation, SBS, every one of these media outlets that defended this cartoon, then hounded, demonized, and chased out of the country Yasmin Abdel-Majid. What did she say? Those of you who may be familiar with her face and maybe have some familiarity with the story, what did Yasmin actually say for her to be hounded out of the country and for her to actually leave Australia behind completely? Anyone actually remember the words she used? She said, lest we forget, yeah? And then she added a couple of other countries, right? What did she add? It was on Anzac Day, everyone was saying, lest we forget, lest we forget. And then she added a couple of other countries to it, right? Lest we forget, Manus and Nauru, Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan. That was it. Basically saying, yes, lest we forget, but also let's not forget refugees locked up in detention indefinitely. That's it. It wasn't overtly being racist, was it? It wasn't putting down our veterans who have gone to war and died. It was just saying that we should also keep in mind the refugees locked up in Manus and Nauru. And for that, she was chased out of the country. Now, the same message was shared by the Gosford Anglican Church, and they were not chased out of the country, were they? They weren't demonized in the public media. The ABC and the SBS and the Courier Mail and the Australian didn't write up stories about it, demonizing them, but Yasmin was. Why? She says it herself in her own words. The reality is, the visceral nature of the fury almost every time I share a perspective or make a statement in any forum is more about who I am than about what is said. And I just want you to keep in mind the sequence of images I've just shown you. From the racist cartoon from Bill Leak to the plethora of media outlets defending Bill for that highly racist content from all aspects of our media industry, to a quote from Bill Leak saying that it's all about a marketplace of free ideas, to remembering Yasmin Abdel-Majid, who was chased and hounded out of the country by the same media outlets for simply saying, lest we forget Manus and Nauru. And then when someone else says the same thing, the Gosford Anglican Church, and nothing is done about it. This is how deeply ingrained racism is within our society. And it's these kinds of dynamics that I want you to be aware of and to be able to unpack for your friends, for your colleagues, for your managers, for your school teachers. This is something that's not just about a particular one individual, whether it's a politician or a cartoonist or an author saying one thing that's slightly inappropriate. It's about a system that, just like Vikings, knows how to link arms and hold the wall, that shield wall, whenever someone who said something racist is under fire, and also whenever someone who's experienced racism tries to speak about that racism. This is the country we're living in. All of those newspaper articles, all of those journalists were all from this continent that we all live on. And that's what we deal with day in, day out. I'm going to go back to my slides to take it a bit further. I want you to think of this. When we think about systems change and systems thinking and about how interrelated some of the things in our society really are, and when you look at this image and think about the news, print media, television media, digital media, radio stations, right? And how in a systematic format, they clamp down on certain individuals and chase them out of the country and defend certain other individuals when they've shared something as highly racist and obviously racist as the image you just saw, right? Who does this impact? Any thoughts on what impact does this have on our society? Oh, there we go. I kind of ruined it for you. There it is. No, it impacts not just old white men. Sorry. I wish it was, because they only make up about 20% of our population. I wish it really was just old white men. It impacts police officers. It impacts judges. It impacts jury members. It impacts school teachers and sports coaches. It impacts the decision-making processes, prejudices, and biases of neighbors and checkout staff. It impacts the prejudices and unconscious bias of security guards, of bus drivers, cab drivers, and tram drivers. This media, news, television, radio, print, impacts our school teachers. It impacts our doctors, our scientists, our lecturers, our magistrates court judges, our ministers. It is not just one subset of society that this type of media impacts. Every single one of us, our family members, our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues, our social networks are impacted by the media we're consuming. And that, my friends, from the SBS and ABC and The Guardian through to the Courier Mail and the Australian and the Conversation, everybody else, you saw how they all lined up to defend Bill Leak, and they all lined up to have a stab at Yasmin. And it impacts our entire country. And that's how we end up with situations like this. Zachary Rolfe chased down Kumanjayi Walker into his house because he was being erratic and he was required for questioning. He shot him at point blank range 3 times because he had entered a dangerous situation and he didn't know how to protect himself, apparently. And this is the mark that Kumanjayi left on him with a pair of scissors. And for that, he was shot 3 times. Police officer testified in court that there was no reasonable grounds for Kumanjayi's shooting the 2nd and 3rd times. To unload 3 rounds into an individual that you've already hit at point blank range was not necessary. And that was another police officer saying that. If you have any doubts as to whether this is systemic or not, there are plenty of reports out there that talk about the systemic violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country. So all of a sudden, I've just taken you from a cartoon image. I've just lost you for a second. Where are we? There we are. From a cartoon of Bill Leak to the media lining up to defend him, to the media hounding Yasmin Abdul-Majid. I've shown you that everybody in our society is impacted by the media they consume, whether it's unconscious bias or outright prejudice. And it impacts our teachers right through to our judges, our juries, our lecturers. And then we end up with racial violence like that. These things can't be separated very easily, my friends. The content that we allow to be shared on our screens, in our newspapers, the cartoons like that that are published and then defended vehemently are all interconnected with every piece of racism that a school child experiences at school, that Adam Goods or any other Aboriginal football player experiences on the field, that every other unconscious bias or prejudice held within a security guard or a jury member or a shopkeeper. These things are not interrelated. You can't just say, oh, we're losing our spirit of larrikinism because we can't show a cartoon anymore. These have got very real life and death outcomes when they impact the minds and hearts of the individuals of our society. And that's how deeply I want you to think about and reflect about racism in our society. It's not just about a cartoon. It's not just about our larrikinism. It's not just about having a laugh. I'm going to skip a few of these images because I've discussed these people already very briefly. I want to take you a little bit deeper now. I want to talk to you about what happens when you think adding a splash of color fixes these things. We could have a whole 1-hour conversation about this interview in and of itself. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of who this person is and the conversation these people had, but on the left is an image of Heredia Lumumba, an ex-football player from Collingwood Football Club. On the right is Waleed Ali, a TV commentator. And the gaslighting that happened in that conversation and the questioning of, drilling down, did it really happen? Or how many people can, verify that? And I've heard some people say that it wasn't that widespread and, was it really systematic or are you just being a bit of a wuss? That was the basic tone of that interview. So this is what we mean when we say a little bit of diversity. Adding a splash of brown doesn't make our media suddenly not racist. In fact, sometimes that splash of brown can reinforce systemic racism when it decides to take a specific angle to a specific story. We saw it again recently with the interview with Lydia Thorpe. So again, anybody who thought that was just a one-off instance, there's a pattern. And if you don't know who these people are, you don't know who Walid is, and you don't know the history of these things, then look into it. And I know that people like Walid have also put out statements about racism and how it impacts them. So it's not about demonizing a person saying, oh, they're terrible. It's about understanding that certain people make it to certain positions because in certain instances, they play a specific role. And that's why they survive. I want you to reflect for a moment. I'm going to pause for a second. I want you to reflect on this person and this conversation that was had with Lydia Thorpe and how belittling and dehumanizing that conversation was, and how this person has the support of the Australian media, and how Yasmin Abdel-Majid was hounded out of our country. And I want you to think, why is that? Why is it that this person survives in this system and the other one is chased out of the country? Why is it that this person is allowed to hold airtime and the other person can't even tweet about something on Twitter? If you think about that deeply enough, you begin to see what systemic racism actually looks like. And as the person in the comments just said there, play the game in the system. Exactly right. If you know how to play the game, you will survive. So increasing diversity alone is not anti-racist. It's about removing and legislating against and banning negative stereotypes in our media. Let's go a little bit deeper. I want to talk to you about the Habibs. We're almost at an hour now. We're scheduled for an hour and 15 minutes. So we've got about 25 minutes to go. We might even go a little bit over tonight. But if you have to leave, you can catch up the rest on the recording. In the chat, if I could just hear from you, please, who remembers this? And what were your thoughts on it? There was a series that came out, I believe, in 2016. It's called Here Come the Habibs on a mainstream network. Anyone remember this? It was short-lived, thankfully, but it certainly stirred up a lot of controversy in the short period that it was on air. They called it funny cringe. Yeah, they called it cringe comedy. Yeah, which is an interesting way of labeling it. And I want to just let everybody know, I don't know about you, but personally, when the criticism came out about Here Come the Habibs, I have to admit, never in my life have I ever seen the Australian media defend a group of Lebanese people as much as they did in this particular situation. Never in my life have I seen Carl and Jackie O and the Australian and the Courier Mail, all of them line up to defend Lebanese people. But in this instance, they did. And again, I ask you the question, why? Now, most of you probably haven't heard about it, thankfully. It's no longer on the air, thankfully. It had a very short lifespan. But I'd like to share you the 2.5-minute clip that highlights not just what the show was and what was so wrong with it, but the defense of racism that I've been speaking to you about for the last hour, okay? For starters, I'll go through some of the defense of it before I show you the final video on this. We had an interview here with Carl and Jackie O, who actually ambushed my dear friend who is now passed, who was at the time struggling from cancer. And in that year, Candy Royale decided to put out a petition calling for it to be ended. And these two people called Candy Royale annoying and a nobody before Candy was even able to say the first words on air. So it was a complete and utter ambush. Teresa, you're on the money. If anyone's reading the comments, Teresa's on the money. It wasn't just Carl and Jackie O. It was the NT News who jumped to the defense of Here Come the Habibs. It was the Courier Mail that jumped to the defense of Here Come the Habibs. It was the Daily Telegraph that jumped to the defense of Here Come the Habibs. It was the Sydney Morning Herald that jumped to the defense of Here Come the Habibs. It was the West Australian that jumped to the defense of Here Come the Habibs. It was the Guardian that jumped to the defense of Here Come the Habibs. And it was the ABC News that jumped to the defense of Here Come the Habibs. Again, the entire Australian media, arm in arm, like a Viking shield war, defending Here Come the Habibs and calling it not racist and outright making fun of anybody who tried to highlight that, hey, this is actually racist. It's black, it's Arab blackface. It's negative stereotypes. It's diminishing, it's demoralizing, it's dehumanizing. Every one of them were made fun of and called snowflakes. The Daily Mail jumped to the defense of Here Come the Habibs. They were so kind as to quote the person who called it Arab blackface, Lebanese businessman, but then they also countered that with John Simmons' quote saying, I think it's a bit of fun. I haven't seen it yet, but it sounds hilarious. So again, this false binary, like, oh yeah, one person doesn't like it, but this guy, he thinks it's hilarious, even though he hasn't seen it. I want you to keep all of that in mind, because it was this particular person's response to it that broke my heart the most. Because when it's the Courier Mail or the Australian, you kind of expect it. Did anybody remember the little piece that our friend Mark put out? You might remember this. Some of you may have heard about the school that tried to end racism. And that's another more recent piece of content that Mark's made. But back in 2016, there was this video that he created, mocking anybody who didn't like Here Come the Habibs. And I'm going to show you this with you. I'm going to share this with you now. I'm going to stop the screen share. I'm going to go to, oops. There we go. Let me know if you can see my screen now. You should be able to see my YouTube screen now. I'm going to remove that song we were just playing, and I'm going to go to this video. You can see that on your screens now, yes? Right. This next 2 minutes and 43 seconds is going to be very enlightening for you. So as I just showed you, dozens of different various media outlets in Australia jumped to the defense of Here Come the Habibs, and anybody who tried to call it out as racist was gaslit, laughed at, and hounded. And then our friend Mark, for the SBS, created this piece of content.
This is, my friends, an outrage. This is not society. You disgust me. This is my nightmare. I don't know what we're yelling about.
Yes, that is pretty much what journalists, newspapers, keyboard warriors, and media commentators, which is not a real job, trust me, I've been one, were saying in the lead up to Channel 9's brand new comedy, Here Come the Habibs.
Meet the Habibs, Australia's newest millionaires.
How much did we win?
22 million.
We're billionaires?
Now, we're not going to judge the comedy of the show. After all, Stones, Glass Houses, we try a lot of comedy here on the feed, and most of it is garbage.
Hey.
Yeah, you guys suck. But what we are interested in is whether or not it's racist. Almost 2,500 people signed a petition calling for the show's cancellation after seeing only a 40-second promo. They certainly did think it was.
While I've got you, you've only seen 52 seconds of it, right? Has anybody got any, is anybody confused as to why this is racist? He makes fun of people who have seen a 40-second promo of it, but I reckon about 20 seconds into that, or 30 seconds into that, we saw this image. So I don't think it takes you more than 30 seconds to work out if something is on the nose or not. But let's keep watching anyway.
They certainly did think it was.
The Habibs aren't staying, Jack. They're going.
But what do actual Lebanese people in Lebanon think about the promo? Well, luckily, a Lebanese news show answered that question for us.
If a civilization like Australia is showing the Lebanese in this way, it is the end of civilization as we know it.
I'm going to pause it there again. I want you to reflect on that for a second. They actually asked an actual Lebanese person what they thought of it. And they said, unfortunately, if a civilization like Australia is showing the Lebanese in this way, it is the end of civilization as we know it. Obviously, a cultural heritage as rich and deep as the Lebanese culture, with that much thousands of years of history in and of itself, being portrayed like the images you just saw, yeah, it is the end of civilization as we know it. It's not the end of the world, but it certainly is a damning statement. Now let's listen to what is said about this.
We know it.
God damn you, Habibs. This is your fault.
As cultural critic Luke Buckmaster said, and he's actually seen the show.
So he mocks the Lebanese person and then throws to cultural critic Luke Buckmaster, who I'm going to show you an image of later.
Here Come the Habibs is about as controversial as a DVD instruction manual.
Oh, my delicate sensibilities.
And certainly judging a show or movie from one tiny promo is essentially judging a book by its cover. I mean, Sucker Punch had an amazing trailer and it was a hot steaming mess. But the criticism wasn't just limited to what was on screen.
What a high, Channel 9. Australia has so many excellent and talented Lebanese artists and writers, and you get a bunch of white people to write this stupid racist drivel? Now that...
I'm going to stop it there for the sake of time. because we are getting close to, we've got 15 minutes or so to go. We're getting close to the end. But watching that already, you can tell how SBS there was aligning with every other media outlet in our country to make fun of anybody who tried to call out the racism. And here come the Habibs. This is what we face, whether it's in our schools, whether it's in the organizations that we work in, whether it's on social media or in the print media, press. Whenever anyone tries to call out racism, there is a common response. This is one of the deepest fears people have about calling racism out in our society, because they understand that their HR department or the media machinery or the administration of their school or the university will react in very much the same way. These are patterns that are repeated. So it actually is a deep risk to call out racism. And you just saw what happened to anybody who did by the Australian media. I'm going to go back to the slides to show you a few images in a row, in a sequence for you to really land this. So there was a quote from the actual Lebanese person who he made fun of and belittled, and then he threw to Luc Buckmeister's comments instead. So this person's thoughts are irrelevant, but cultural critic Luc Buckmaster has got something to say about this, and it's his words that call it as controversial as a DVD instruction manual. Apparently, this person's words we need to take to heart, because he knows what's offensive to Lebanese people, but not this person. And Mark somehow manages to keep a straight face while producing this type of content, these types of images. He somehow doesn't understand how perpetuating this type of image and this type of image and this type of image is in any way, shape, or form connected to this type of image and this type of image. How reinforcing people's existing prejudices and unconscious bias can somehow lead to more discrimination against certain other people. And he thought it was all just a bit of a laugh, and he made fun of anybody who tried to call out how wrong it was. These are just two pieces of media content that we've just covered. We could spend thousands of hours, thousands and thousands of hours unpacking various instances where something that was outright racist and probably obvious to some people, like the Bill Leak cartoon. That was one racist incident to some people, and some people will be able to understand that. But then the support network that comes around Bill Leak in his defense shows you what we mean when we say systemic racism. The support system that then turned, the very same individuals, in fact, and media outlets that then turned on Yasmin Abdel-Majid when she said, "Lest we forget Manis and Nauru." The same people who supported that Bill Leak cartoon hounded her out of the country. And then it becomes more subtle when here come the Habibs. Some black and brown people might not have any issue with that. They're like, oh, it's a bit of a laugh and, relax a bit. But the problem isn't just that. It's that when someone who does have an academic background in this space, who does have some race conscious understandings, who does criticize that, gets laughed at, hounded, demonized, and made fun of for calling out the racism in that. So you see, it's a slightly more subtle example of it. If you allow me, we've got 15 minutes to go. I want to show you another example of something else that you really need to have highly attuned ears and eyes to be able to understand what's really going on here. And it's a video clip that many of you may have seen already. It's from Q&A, and I'm going to share a piece of it with you. It's a 6-minute clip. We're not going to watch the whole thing, but I will share the link with anybody who'd like to watch the rest of it. So I'm going to go back to my slides. This is the episode. In the chat, let us know already if you remember this particular episode of Q&A. If anyone remembers, it was a few years ago now, but the video of Auntie Rosalie Kenneth Monks is on YouTube and doing the rounds. Does anyone remember this one? Yes, got a few yeses there. Right. I want to share the first part of this video with you, and then I'm going to pause it. I want you to listen carefully to the person's question and what they're asking and what they're saying in the asking of that question. This is a really deep analysis of content here. Some of you might enjoy this. Some of you might think this is going a little bit too deep into it for this late on a Tuesday night. But let's see how we can go. I'm going to play not this video, the other one. There we go. The Q&A episode. All right, let's listen closely to this one.
Got another question. I'll bring in everyone to reflect on this on the back of that. Utopia is a documentary made by John Pilger in which he highlights the denial of justice for Aboriginal people, how little he says has changed in Australia over the last 30 years. It's also the starting point for our next question, which comes from Sophie McIntosh.
Okay, so those of you watching from home, Utopia, documentary talking about the inequities that are facing Aboriginal Australians is the subject matter here, okay? And this question is about that documentary, highlighting racial injustice in this continent.
Thanks, Tony. Documentaries such as Utopia tend to just affirm and add to beliefs and understandings that I already have. But I know for some people, they tend to provoke a knee-jerk reaction, as they can be seen as an excuse for indulging in white guilt for non-Indigenous activists for social equality. So I'm interested in the panel's opinions about whether documentaries such as Utopia do productively contribute towards reconciliation efforts, or whether perhaps they reinforce the existing societal divide and beliefs by only reaching an audience who is already either battling or sympathising with these very serious ongoing issues.
Okay, Stuart Roos.
Right, I'm going to pause it there. I'd like to hear your thoughts. You've heard the question, you know the context. I'll stop the screen share. So the context was the documentary Utopia, talking about the inequity and injustice faced by Aboriginal Australians. And then the question, as you just heard, was basically saying in a short way, what do you think, the panel, what are your thoughts on the question of, do documentaries like this that highlight the injustices faced by Aboriginal people benefit reconciliation, or do they harm the movement for reconciliation because they make some people feel ashamed or guilty? What are your thoughts on that? Anyone else who's had time to reflect on just the question itself before we even go any further? What is the subtext of that question? What is that question really doing? What are the dynamics at play there? Alex says it's silencing. Fatima says it's derailing. Someone's asked, yep, they're asking, is the documentary worthy of our attention? So she's questioning the validity of the documentary. It is silencing because it's saying, you know, is it worthwhile watching? The subtext of that is, I'm not a racist, but, thank you, Teresa. It's saying I'm not a racist, but. It's saying, yes, I do care about these issues, but that documentary made me feel uncomfortable, right? That's the first part of what that person's saying, right? Nadia Chavez says white fragility epitomized. For those of you not familiar with white fragility, we'll unpack that in a later session, very nuanced topic, but basically this is it. So this person's saying, I care about Aboriginal people, but that documentary made me feel uncomfortable. And what are your thoughts on whether or not documentaries like this help the cause of reconciliation or act to its detriment? If I feel uncomfortable, maybe others also feel a bit ashamed and embarrassed about the injustices faced by Aboriginal people. That's the first thing that's wrong with that. What's particularly wrong about that is, for the sake of time, I'll be brief. This person has just acknowledged that racial injustice exists, health gap, wealth gap, incarceration rate, child removal rates, deaths in custody, all of that. All of those horrific instances, but they have said their feelings of being embarrassed or ashamed are more important than talking about the very real life and death situation faced by Aboriginal people in their communities. So they're putting their feelings of feeling embarrassed and ashamed on a higher level of value, of respecting that, as opposed to the lived reality of what their experience, of what Aboriginal people are experiencing, first and foremost. And it's asking the panel, what do you think, you know, is a benefit or, you know, of this documentary? Should we maybe not show documentaries like that because it makes me feel uncomfortable? That's basically what she just asked. And it's specifically to do with reconciliation. Now, another point on this idea of reconciliation, I really want to remind everybody here, and for you to say this out there, wherever you go, everywhere you go. Reconciliation is when two people have a falling out, and they reconcile, and they two mates or two family members reconcile and they make up again. Reconciliation is not what you do to recover and heal from genocide, colonization, stolen children. right? So in the beginning, it's the wrong word. Secondly, in order to work towards reconciliation, it's not about let's all get along and be nice and just like love each other. Reconciliation and closing the gap is about addressing the real lived experience and the real life inequities that exist in society. It's not about feelings and emotions. It's about statistics, health, wealth, incarceration rates, etc. That's what reconciliation is talking about. It's not about let's just hold hands and get along with each other. It's not about feelings, unfortunately. And that's the two things that are wrong with that question. One person's fragility and their embarrassment or their nerves or their shame about this, what's actually happening, was put on a higher pedestal and valued more rather than the actual lived reality. And says, I'd rather not talk about those things because it makes me feel uncomfortable. And because it makes me feel uncomfortable, I'm less likely to want to reconcile with Aboriginal people. That's what that question just asked. And I could speak for you on hours on end about just that question alone, without even going into what happens next. We're running short of time, so I'm going to be brief and wrap this session up today. But I want to go back to the slides for a second and show you this. Some of you may have noticed this, some of you may have not. The actual segment was titled Primates, Populism and Utopia. That panel was called Primates, Populism and Utopia. Utopia referring to the documentary about the situation of Aboriginal Australians in society. If you haven't worked out what's wrong with the way that entire panel was framed and created, then you haven't been paying attention enough. Primates, populism and utopia, referring to Aboriginal communities and the face injustices they face. This whole conversation, one of the first questions I asked Jane was, what are some of the things we can learn from primate cultures and this and that and human beings and blah, blah, blah. So they were already subtly trying to make this bridge between primates and society. And in the middle of this conversation, they shoved the conversation about Aboriginal communities. Just having that conversation going on together already is not right. Then there's a question. Let's go back to the slides, and I want to show you something. First and foremost, that question should have been vetted and not even asked to begin with. Anybody who's got any sense and sensibility about them, and plenty of you in the chat did. Plenty of you in the chat talked about what a mess, embarrassed that these are adults. Thank you, Ayan. Right? Some of you spoke about it asks an Aboriginal to answer it. Well, that would have been lovely if they did, but unfortunately they didn't. And we're going to go into that in a second. Someone else here talks about white guilt as an indulgence. Someone else said, as soon as I heard overindulgence of white guilt, I felt uneasy. Thank you, Nicholas. Exactly. Avoiding experiencing uncomfortable feelings. That was more important to this person. And then the person who was in the production team, the people who vet these questions and the audience members didn't think there was anything wrong with that question. And yet so many of you in this chat are fully aware of what was wrong with that question to begin with. So we've got the title of the segment, the question being asked and not being vetted by a member of the production team, and then the host here who asks the question and then throws to this gentleman here who gives not an outright overtly racist answer. He means well, this person, but he actually gave an answer that did reinforce some very, very negative racial stereotypes. And he in fact does not identify as a racist whatsoever. And he's a very nice, not racist person. So this is the first person to answer that question. And then we didn't go to Auntie Rosalie. They threw to this person who shared their very racist perspective on this panel and agreed with the person asking the question. I want you to reflect on what I just said there. He agreed with the person asking a question. What does that mean? What do I mean when I say the person on the panel agreed with the person asking the question? Because the question wasn't actually a question. It was a statement. And it said something. The subtext that you also rightly outlined in the chat function. Right? The subtext was that my feelings are more important than the lived reality of Aboriginal people. So that person agreed with that sentiment and reinforced the idea. And he said, yeah, you're right. These documentaries are terrible. They're not helping us to become united, and they're acting to the detriment of reconciliation because they're making people like me feel uncomfortable. So we've got a production team that allows the segment to be called Primates, Populism and Utopia. We've got a production team that allows a question like that to be asked. That person came up with that question. Then the host throws to two white men to speak on a topic that none of them should have any right to speak on to begin with. It's none of their absolute business. And then they only finally, towards the end, throw to Auntie Rosalie Conant Monks to speak her words. I want you to think about that and the processes involved in making these decisions and the dynamics that played out here, and even the order in which people were allowed to speak. When the one person on that entire panel who actually did have a right to speak about whether or not documentaries like that are detrimental to reconciliation or not. There's only one person on that entire panel who had the right to speak on that question. And yet they are placed on the bottom of the list. And by doing so, the power dynamics are reinforced because you throw to the most important person's opinion first. It's like no one questions that. We all understand that. You don't throw to the most important perspective at the end. You allow the person asking the question, the host, and the two other white men to create the framework and the context, and the Aboriginal woman gets to speak right at the very end in a very respectful way, saying, I am not the problem. I am a cultured person. I have a culture. You have tried to diminish my culture and make me the problem, but it is you who has tried to impose your culture on top of my culture and then caused me to look like I am the issue. I am not the issue. And that's a really powerful speech that I would recommend you all go out there and watch. But I want you to consider everything that happened before we got to that final moment and all of the seemingly well-intentioned, well-meaning individuals who made terrible choices in that process, whether it was overt or unconscious, and ended up reinforcing racism and reinforcing fragility and reinforcing one person's feelings over another person's life. There's so much more we could unpack. We're bang on 8:45 now, which is what we're meant to schedule to end these sessions. So I'd like to finish close enough to time as we can. Those of you who'd like to look into some of the solutions to some of these issues, I've got some slides at the back. I've already asked you to look into this, the dynamics between what happened with Adam Goodes and Taylor Harris. I'm giving you homework now. If you really want to learn about what I'm talking about here, watch The Australian Dream first on ABC iView. And then if you want to understand sexism in Australian society, watch Kick Like Taylor. Right? Two different documentaries. One's about racism in football in AFL. The other's about sexism in Australian society, but also about an AFL player. And then I want you to look at and consider, after you've watched these two documentaries, whether it's this week, next week, or the following week, I want you to reflect on the different response that the media gave each of these sports professionals when they faced racism or sexism from the public. That's your bit of homework for tonight. You can reflect on this dynamic as well later on. And there's some slides at the end of the slide deck that you will be able to download from the website that talks about how media, justice, and education systems can contribute to racism. Adding a sprinkling of diversity does not solve the issue of racism. And this is how we do. We've got to address unjust power dynamics. We've got to implement legislation against negative stereotypes and against outright hate speech, because we've just looked at how that impacts the hearts and minds of people in positions of power. And then we've got to address the overwhelming whiteness within media institutions, not just a sprinkling of diversity on certain panels, but within decision-making situations. So these are the slides at the end of this deck, which I'm going to make available to you on the website as well. And you can download these to read these in a bit more depth as well. These are some of the ideas for legislation, mandatory training for hosts and journalists, maybe some minimum requirements for cultural and ethnic diversity in media organizations, perhaps some racial vilification laws for commentators. We need to really deeply reflect on what the impact of their words actually are. None of our words in Australian media, in a film, in a book, are actually neutral. We are either working towards and trying to create justice and equity because our world is unjust at the moment, or we are reinforcing pre-existing power dynamics in general, as well as prejudices and stereotypes. So now that you go out there with these kinds of awarenesses, these certain veils lifted off, I want you to consider different news stories, how certain people are called, how certain people are said to be accused of racism instead of have been racist, just think about some of the context, the subtext, and consider some of the patterns that exist within our media of racism, the defense of racism, of calling out racism, the attacks on people who call out racism, and keep an eye out for that. Because if we actually want to create a society that is just and connected and cohesive and peaceful and united and all the rest of it, we need to address racial inequity. And our media system needs to evolve beyond what it has been doing in the past to a point where it can actually contribute to that shared vision of a united society that we actually want to be a part of. So with that, I'm going to end tonight's session. This is week 3 of our conversations on racial equity. And thank you all. I've noticed that we've had about 60 or so people here all night long, and none of you have really left. So thank you for your resilience and your strength. Thank you for being here to begin with and for putting up with me for a whole hour and 15 minutes. I hope that was helpful for you. If you've missed any part of it, you can watch it online. And if you would like to invite other people to these sessions, please do. I really appreciate that and love very much the fact that you're here with me for all this time, week after week, to unpack racism in society so we can work together towards creating a much more united society. Sending you lots of love. I'm giving you a few minutes to get your messages in because I do like reading these. If you enjoyed tonight's session, let me know either in the chat, send me an email, connect with me on LinkedIn or Facebook or anywhere else. And if you've got questions about content that you'd like for me to unpack further, send me an email. I might have already written an article about it. And if there's anything I can do for your organization or your school or your department, also reach out to me if you'd like. Muchas gracias. Buenas noches. Thank you very much, everybody. Lots of love to you all, and look forward to seeing you all next week, same time. Much love. Bye-bye.